The early morning sun cast a golden glow over John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York City, where a bustling crowd of travelers moved through the terminal like a river carving its path. Inside the sleek cabin of Flight 237 bound for Los Angeles, the atmosphere buzzed with the hum of anticipation. Businessmen in crisp suits tapped away at laptops, families juggled carry-ons and snacks, and the cabin crew darted through the aisles with practiced efficiency, their smiles polished but strained under the weight of a fully booked flight. The air was thick with the scent of coffee perfume and the faint metallic tang of the airplane itself, a Boeing 737 ready to slice through the skies. Passengers settled into their seats, some flipping through in-flight magazines, others staring out at the tarmac where baggage carts zipped by. Amid this modern, well-dressed crowd, an unusual figure stepped aboard, drawing curious glances and subtle frowns. Ellen Carter. A woman of about 60 shuffled down the aisle, her worn-out coat hanging loosely over a faded blouse and patched trousers. Her face, lined with the weight of years, carried a quiet sadness, her gray hair pulled back in a messy bun that seemed to defy the polished order of the cabin. Her presence was like a smudge on a clean window, jarring in its contrast to the sleek surroundings. Ellen clutched a crumpled boarding pass in her weathered hand, her fingers trembling slightly as she scanned the seat numbers above. The passengers nearby watched her with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. A young woman in a tailored blazer, seated in 16B, wrinkled her nose as Ellen passed, pressing a tissue to her face, as if shielding herself from an unpleasant odor. The man next to her, engrossed in his phone, muttered something under his breath, his lips curling into a smirk. Ellen, seemingly oblivious to the stares, found her seat 17A by the window and eased herself into it with a soft sigh. She set a small, tattered bag at her feet, its zipper broken, revealing a glimpse of an old book and a pair of worn gloves inside. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if each action carried the weight of a memory she wasn't ready to share. She gazed out the window, her dark eyes tracing the outline of a distant plane climbing into the sky, a faint flicker of something nostalgia perhaps crossing her weathered face. The cabin crew, led by a young flight attendant named Sarah, moved through the pre-flight checks with brisk efficiency. Sarah's sharp eyes caught sight of Ellen, and her professional smile faltered for a moment. She approached, her heels clicking softly on the carpeted floor. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice polite, but laced with suspicion. "May I see your boarding pass again?" Ellen turned from the window, her expression calm and unshaken. "Of course," she replied softly, her voice steady despite the scrutiny. She handed over the boarding pass, its edges frayed from being clutched too tightly. Sarah examined it closely, her brows knitting together as she glanced from the pass to Ellen's face, as if trying to reconcile the woman's appearance with the legitimacy of her ticket. The pass was valid seat 17A economy class, but Sarah's hesitation lingered, her eyes narrowing slightly before she nodded and returned it. "Thank you," she said curtly, turning away with a shake of her head, as if unconvinced that Ellen belonged here. The woman in 16B, now openly irritated, leaned toward her companion and whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "Can you believe this? They let just anyone on these flights now." Her companion chuckled, glancing at Ellen's worn coat. "Probably got the ticket from a charity or something," he replied, his tone dripping with condescension. Ellen's hands rested quietly in her lap, her fingers tracing the edge of her coat, but her face remained impassive, her gaze fixed on the clouds outside. The cabin continued to hum with activity as the plane taxied toward the runway, the engine's low rumble vibrating through the seats. A businessman in a pinstripe suit, seated across the aisle, called out to Sarah as she passed, "Excuse me, miss, is there any way I can switch seats?" "It's a bit uncomfortable here," he said, his eyes flicking toward Ellen. Sarah offered an apologetic smile. "I'm so sorry, sir. The flight is completely full today. You'll have to make do." The businessman huffed, adjusting his tie and sinking back into his seat with a scowl. The murmurs of discontent grew louder as more passengers noticed Ellen. A mother in the row behind her pulled her child closer, whispering, "Don't stare, honey." A young man in a hoodie, scrolling through his phone, snorted and muttered, "What's she even doing here? Looks like she hasn't showered in a week." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting, but Ellen didn't flinch. Her eyes remained locked on the world outside, where the tarmac gave way to the open sky. There was a quiet dignity in her stillness, a strength that went unnoticed by those too quick to judge. The plane's engines roared as it prepared for takeoff, the cabin lights dimming slightly. Sarah's voice crackled over the intercom, delivering the standard safety briefing, but her eyes kept darting toward Ellen, as if expecting her to cause trouble. The other passengers, meanwhile, settled into their routines. Some plugged in earbuds, others opened laptops, but the undercurrent of disdain for the woman in 17A lingered like a bad smell. As the plane lifted off, climbing through the morning haze, the cabin settled into a tense rhythm. Ellen leaned her head against the window, her reflection faint against the glass. The lines on her face told a story of hardship, but her eyes held a spark of something deeper, resilience, perhaps, or a memory of better days. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, faded photograph, its edges curled with age. The image showed a younger Ellen, standing proudly in a pilot's uniform, her smile radiant against the backdrop of a military airfield. Her fingers brushed over the photo, a quiet moment of reflection that went unnoticed by the passengers around her. The woman in 16B, still clutching her tissue, shot Ellen another glance. Her lips pursed in disapproval. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to her companion. "I paid good money for this seat, and now I'm stuck next to this." Her words were sharp, meant to wound, but Ellen's expression didn't change. She tucked the photo back into her bag and closed her eyes, as if retreating into a world where judgment couldn't reach her. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering drinks and snacks, their smiles masking the chaos of a packed flight. Sarah paused near Ellen's row, her eyes lingering on the older woman. There was something about Ellen's quiet composure that unsettled her, as if she sensed there was more to this passenger than met the eye. But the demands of the job pulled her away, and she continued down the aisle. Her clipboard clutched tightly. The passengers, meanwhile, grew more vocal in their complaints. A man in a polo shirt, seated a few rows back, leaned forward and said to his neighbor, "I bet she's some kind of scam artist. No way she belongs in a place like this." His neighbor nodded, adding, "They should have checked her ticket more thoroughly. What's next, letting homeless people board first class?" The laughter that followed was harsh, a chorus of prejudice that echoed through the cabin. Ellen, however, remained untouched by the venom around her. She opened her eyes and gazed out the window again, watching the clouds roll by like waves in an endless sea. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign flicked off, prompting a flurry of activity as passengers unbuckled and stretched. The woman in 16B stood to retrieve something from the overhead bin, deliberately avoiding eye contact with Ellen. As she sat back down, she muttered, "This is going to be a long flight." Her companion smirked, adding, "At least we're not in her shoes." The comment drew a few chuckles from nearby seats, but Ellen's face remained serene, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There was a quiet strength in her silence, a resilience that hinted at a life shaped by challenges far greater than the petty judgments of strangers. As the plane soared over the Midwest, the cabin settled into a fragile calm. The hum of conversation, the clink of plastic cups, and the occasional cry of a child filled the air. Ellen's presence, though, remained a point of tension, a silent challenge to the assumptions of those around her. The businessman across the aisle glanced at her again, his expression a mix of irritation and curiosity. He leaned toward his seatmate and whispered, "You think she's got some kind of story, or is she just lost?" His seatmate shrugged, uninterested. "Doesn't matter. She's out of place here." The words were casual, but they carried the weight of a society quick to judge, quick to dismiss. Ellen, however, seemed to carry her own world within her, one where the opinions of others held no sway. She reached into her bag again, this time pulling out a small, worn notebook. She opened it to a page filled with neat handwriting, her eyes scanning the words as if they were a lifeline to another time. The flight continued, the plane cutting through the sky with a steady hum. Outside, the clouds thickened, hinting at a storm brewing in the distance. Inside, the passengers remained blissfully unaware of the challenges ahead, their focus fixed on their own small worlds, phones, laptops, and the occasional glance at the woman in 17A. Ellen, for her part, seemed content to stay in her own world, her eyes drifting between the notebook and the window. There was a story behind those eyes, a history that no one on the plane could have guessed. And as the first faint tremors of turbulence shook the cabin, the stage was set for a moment that would change everything, a moment when the woman they had dismissed as unworthy would reveal the strength that lay hidden beneath her worn exterior. The cabin of Flight 237, soaring high above the patchwork fields of the Midwest, hummed with the steady rhythm of air travel. The low drone of the engines blended with the soft clatter of drink carts, and the murmur of conversations, creating a cocoon of routine that enveloped the passengers. Outside, the clouds had begun to thicken their edges, tinged with gray, hinting at the storm brewing in the distance. Inside, Ellen Carter sat quietly in seat 17, her worn coat draped over her lap like a shield against the world. Her eyes, deep and reflective, lingered on the small notebook in her hands, its pages filled with neat handwritten notes that seemed to anchor her to a past no one else could see. The passengers around her, still casting occasional glances of disdain or curiosity, remained oblivious to the weight of her story. The woman in 16B, still clutching her tissue, had settled into an uneasy silence, her earlier complaints reduced to pointed sighs. The businessman across the aisle, now engrossed in a spreadsheet, barely noticed Ellen, but the undercurrent of judgment in the cabin persisted, a silent verdict on her faded clothes and weathered appearance. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, a voice broke through the hum of the cabin. "Ellen. Ellen Carter, is that you?" The words came from a man a few rows back, his tone a mix of surprise and condescension. Ellen's head turned slowly, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the faces around her. The man, dressed in a sharp navy suit, with a flashy watch glinting on his wrist, stood up and made his way down the aisle. He was in his late 50s, with neatly combed hair and a confident stride that demanded attention. "It's me, James Larson," he said, stopping beside her row. "We went to high school together in Chicago. Remember, class of '83? His smile was wide, but it carried a hint of smugness, as if he were presenting himself as a trophy of success. Ellen's face softened slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing her features. "James," she said quietly, her voice steady but tinged with weariness. "It's been a long time." James slid into the empty aisle seat in Ellen's row, ignoring the annoyed glance from the woman in 16B. "I couldn't believe it when I saw you," he said, his voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby passengers. "You were the star of our class, always acing every test, leading the debate team, the whole 9 yards. And now—" He gestured vaguely at her worn coat and scuffed shoes, his smile faltering into something closer to pity. "What happened, Ellen? You look like you've had a rough go of it." The words were meant to sound sympathetic, but they dripped with arrogance, as if his own success, A tailored suit, a corner office, a life of privilege made him superior. Ellen's lips curved into a faint smile, one that held more patience than warmth. "Life's a long road, James," she said simply, her eyes drifting back to the window. "Not all of us take the same path." James leaned back, undeterred by her reserve. "Well, look at me," he said, adjusting his tie with a flourish. "CEO of a tech startup in Silicon Valley. We just closed a deal for $50 million last quarter. I'm flying to LA for a board meeting, first class, next time, I hope." He chuckled, expecting her to be impressed, but Ellen's expression remained unchanged. She nodded politely, her fingers tracing the edge of her notebook. "That's wonderful, James," she said, her voice calm but distant. "I'm glad you're doing well." Her words were polite, but there was a quiet strength in them, a refusal to be drawn into his game of comparison. James, however, seemed oblivious to her restraint. "You know, Ellen, you could have been something big," he continued, his tone almost lecturing. "You had all that potential. What happened? Did you just give up?" The question hung in the air, sharp and intrusive, drawing a few curious glances from nearby passengers. Ellen's gaze drifted to the clouds outside her mind, slipping into the past. She saw herself at 25, standing tall in her Air Force uniform, her pilot's wings gleaming on her chest. She had been a prodigy, one of the first women to fly combat missions for the U.S. Air Force. Her call sign, Captain Carter, was whispered with awe in the hangars, her name synonymous with precision and courage. She remembered the roar of jet engines, the thrill of slicing through the sky, the weight of responsibility as she guided her squadron through perilous missions. But then came the incident, a mechanical failure during a training flight, a crash that wasn't her fault, but cost her everything. The investigation had been swift and unforgiving, pinning the blame on her despite the evidence. She was grounded, her wings clipped, her career reduced to a footnote in a military report. The shame had driven her into isolation, away from the skies she loved, into a life of quiet struggle. The notebook in her hands held fragments of that story, sketches of planes, notes on flight patterns, and a single photograph tucked between the pages showing her younger self standing proudly beside a fighter jet. She snapped back to the present as James continued his monologue, oblivious to her inner world. "You should have seen me at our last reunion," he said, grinning. "Everyone was asking about you, you know. The girl who could have had it all. I told them you probably moved to some small town living off the grid or something." He laughed, but the sound was hollow, and Ellen's silence seemed to unsettle him. He shifted in his seat, his confidence wavering. "So what do you do now, Ellen? You working or—" His question trailed off, as if he couldn't imagine her doing anything of note. Ellen's eyes met his, and for the first time there was a spark of something fierce in her gaze. "I get by," she said simply, her voice carrying a weight that made James pause. He opened his mouth to say something else, but the plane gave a sudden jolt, cutting him off. The cabin lights flickered, and a low murmur of unease rippled through the passengers. Sarah's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We're experiencing some light turbulence, but everything is under control." The plane shook again, a little harder this time, and the murmurs grew louder. The woman in 16B gripped her armrest, her tissue forgotten, while the businessman across the aisle looked up from his laptop, his brow furrowed. Ellen, however, remained calm, her hands steady as she tucked her notebook back into her bag. She had felt turbulence before, worse than this, in the cockpit of a fighter jet, dodging enemy fire. This was nothing, she told herself, but the growing tension in the cabin told her otherwise. James, now visibly nervous, glanced at Ellen. "You don't seem fazed," he said, forcing a laugh. Guess you've seen worse, huh? His attempt at humor fell flat, and Ellen offered a small nod. Something like that, she replied, her voice low but steady. The plane steadied for a moment, but the clouds outside grew darker, their edges swirling with the promise of a storm. The passengers around them began to fidget, their earlier disdain for Ellen replaced by a shared sense of unease. The mother in the row behind Ellen whispered to her child, "It's okay, sweetie, just a little bump." The young man in the hoodie who had mocked Ellen earlier now stared out his window, his phone forgotten. The cabin, once filled with the noise of judgment, now buzzed with a different kind of energy fear. Ellen's thoughts drifted back to her days in the Air Force, to the countless hours spent training for emergencies just like this. She remembered the simulator sessions, the endless drills, the voice of her instructor, barking orders as she learned to navigate through storms and system failures. She had been fearless then, or so she thought. The truth was, fear was always there, but she had learned to channel it, to turn it into focus. Now, as the plane rocked gently, she felt that old instinct stirring a quiet readiness that had never truly left her. She glanced at James, who was now gripping the armrest, his earlier bravado gone. "It'll pass," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made him look at her with new eyes. The turbulence grew stronger, the plane dipping and swaying as if caught in an invisible current. Sarah moved through the aisle, checking on passengers, her face tight with forced calm. She paused near Ellen's row, her eyes meeting Ellen's for a brief moment. There was something in Ellen's gaze, steady, unflinching, that seemed to catch Sarah off guard. She nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something unspoken, before moving on. The passengers, meanwhile, grew more vocal, their complaints now directed at the weather rather than Ellen. "This is getting ridiculous," the businessman muttered, closing his laptop with a snap. "They should have warned us about this." The woman in 16, her face pale, whispered to her companion, "I just want to get to LA in one piece." Ellen, however, remained a still point in the storm. She reached into her bag and pulled out the faded photograph again, her fingers brushing over the image of her younger self. The memory of that day, the pride, the freedom, the certainty felt both distant and achingly close. She had been Captain Carter then, a name that carried weight, a name that meant something. Now, she was just Ellen, the woman in the worn coat, the target of whispers and sneers. But as the plane shuddered again, she felt a spark of that old fire, a reminder of who she had been and who she still was deep down. The storm outside was growing, and with it, the sense that something was about to change. The cabin, the passengers, the flight itself, all of it was hurtling toward a moment that would test them all. And Ellen Carter, the woman they had dismissed, was about to step into the spotlight. The cabin of Flight 237 vibrated with a tense energy as the plane sliced through the darkening sky somewhere over the plains of Nebraska. The turbulence that had begun as a mild annoyance had escalated into something far more unsettling, with the Boeing 737 lurching and swaying as if caught in the grip of an angry giant. Outside, the clouds had thickened into a roiling mass of gray and black, their edges lit by flashes of distant lightning. Inside, the passengers clung to their armrests, their earlier chatter replaced by a chorus of nervous whispers and stifled gasps. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting fleeting shadows across the cabin, while the hum of the engines seemed to strain against the storm's ferocity. Ellen Carter sat quietly in seat 17. Her worn coat folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the chaos beyond the window. Unlike the others, she showed no signs of panic, her face a mask of calm resolve, as if the storm were an old adversary she had faced before. The notebook she had been holding earlier was now tucked away, replaced by a steady gaze that seemed to see beyond the clouds into a past where she had once commanded the skies. The woman in 16B, who had been so quick to judge Ellen earlier, now gripped her seat with white-knuckled hands, her tissue crumpled and forgotten on the tray table. Across the aisle, the businessman in the pinstripe suit muttered a curse under his breath, his laptop sliding slightly as the plane dipped again. James Larson, still seated in the aisle seat of Ellen's row, forced a nervous laugh, his earlier bravado crumbling. "This is some storm, huh?" he said, glancing at Ellen, hoping for reassurance. She nodded slightly, her expression unreadable. "It's manageable," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made James pause. He opened his mouth to respond, but another jolt shook the plane, silencing him. The cabin lights flickered again, and a child's cry pierced the air, quickly hushed by a mother's soothing words. The tension was palpable, a shared fear that bound the passengers together, erasing for the moment their earlier disdain for the woman in the worn coat. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, moved through the aisle with practiced calm, her smile strained but professional. She paused to check on passengers, offering reassurances that sounded hollow even to her own ears. "We're just hitting some rough air," she said to a worried couple, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her eyes. But as she reached the front of the cabin, a sharp buzz from the intercom interrupted her routine. The voice of the co-pilot, Captain Ryan Mitchell, crackled through the speakers, tight with urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We're experiencing significant turbulence, but our crew is handling the situation." The announcement did little to quell the rising panic, and Sarah's face tightened as she exchanged a glance with another flight attendant. Something was wrong, something more than just turbulence. Moments later, the cabin door burst open, and Sarah emerged from the galley, her face pale and her hands trembling. She hurried down the aisle, her eyes scanning the passengers with desperate intensity. "Is there a doctor on board?" she called out, her voice breaking slightly. "It's an emergency." The cabin fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. A middle-aged man in a sweater seated near the back stood up. "I'm a doctor," he said, his voice steady but concerned. "Dr. Stephen Harris." He grabbed his bag and followed Sarah toward the cockpit, the passengers watching in tense silence. Whispers began to spread speculation about a heart attack, a seizure, something dire. Ellen's eyes narrowed slightly, her hands resting calmly in her lap, but her mind was racing, piecing together the situation with the instincts of someone who had faced crises before. Minutes later, Dr. Harris returned, his face grim. He leaned toward Sarah and spoke in a low voice, but the words carried to the nearby rows. "The captain's had a stroke. He's unconscious, not responding. We need to get him to a hospital immediately." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin, and the air seemed to grow heavier, as if the storm outside had seeped inside. The woman in 16B clutched her companion's arm, her voice trembling. "A stroke. Who's flying the plane?" The businessman across the aisle snapped his laptop shut, his face ashen. "This can't be happening," he muttered, his earlier arrogance replaced by raw fear. James turned to Ellen, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that? The pilot's down. We're in the middle of a storm and the pilot's down." His voice cracked, betraying the panic he could no longer hide. Sarah, now visibly shaken, grabbed the intercom with trembling hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice wavering but determined, "we have a serious situation. Our captain is incapacitated, and we need to know if anyone on board has experience flying an aircraft. Please, if you have any training, come forward now." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, and the cabin erupted into a cacophony of fear. Passengers looked at one another, their faces pale. their eyes searching for someone, anyone who could save them. The young man in the hoodie who had mocked Ellen earlier shook his head frantically. "This is insane. We're all going to die." The mother behind Ellen clutched her child tighter, whispering prayers under her breath. The storm outside roared the plane, shaking violently as lightning illuminated the clouds, casting eerie flashes across the cabin. James turned to Ellen, his voice laced with desperation. "This is bad, Ellen. Really bad. Nobody's going to step up. Who even knows how to fly a plane like this?" His words were cut off by a sudden movement beside him. Ellen Carter raised her hand, her gesture calm but deliberate. The cabin fell silent, all eyes turning to the woman in the worn coat. Sarah, standing in the aisle, froze her expression, a mix of disbelief and hope. "Ma'am," she said, stepping closer, Do you have experience?" Ellen's eyes met Sarah's, steady and unflinching. "Yes," she said simply. "I can fly. It's been a while, but I can do it." Her voice was calm, almost serene, but it carried a weight that silenced the murmurs around her. For a moment, no one spoke, the only sound the howling wind outside and the creak of the plane's frame. James laughed nervously, his voice shrill. "Ellen, come on. You fly a commercial jet. You're going to get us all killed." His words sparked a wave of protest from the other passengers. The woman in 16B shook her head vehemently. "No way. She doesn't even look like she belongs here, let alone in a cockpit." The businessman chimed in, his voice rising. "There has to be someone else. Someone qualified." The young man in the hoodie shouted, "She's probably delusional. Look at her." But Sarah, ignoring the outcry, leaned closer to Ellen, her eyes searching the older woman's face. "Ma'am, are you sure this is a Boeing 737 and we're in a storm? Can you really handle it?" Ellen's gaze didn't waver. "I flew F-16s in worse conditions than this," she said, her voice steady as steel. "I can handle it." A shout came from the cockpit, urgent and strained. "Sarah, if she's got experience, send her up here now." It was Captain Ryan Mitchell, the co-pilot, his voice cracking over the intercom. "I can't manage this alone, and we're losing control." The urgency in his tone cut through the passengers' protests, and Sarah nodded, her decision made. "Come with me," she said to Ellen, gesturing toward the cockpit. Ellen stood, her movements slow but purposeful, as if shedding the weight of the passenger's judgment. Her worn coat slipped to the seat, revealing a faded blouse that bore the faint outline of a military patch, barely noticeable but a hint of her past. The cabin watched in stunned silence as she walked down the aisle, her steps steady despite the plane's violent shaking. James stared after her, his mouth open, his earlier condescension replaced by a mix of shock and shame. As Ellen reached the cockpit door, Sarah hesitated, her hand on the handle. "What's your name, ma'am?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent. Ellen paused, her eyes glinting with a spark of the fire she had once carried. "Ellen Carter," she said. "Captain Ellen Carter, U.S. Air Force, retired." The words hit Sarah like a bolt of lightning, and she nodded, opening the door. Inside the cockpit, Captain Ryan was struggling with the controls, his face slick with sweat as the plane bucked against the storm. He glanced up as Ellen entered, his eyes widening in recognition. "Captain Carter?" he said, his voice a mix of disbelief and relief. You're the Captain Carter, the one who flew the Desert Storm missions." Ellen gave a small nod, her expression focused. "That was a long time ago," she said, slipping into the captain's seat. "Let's get this plane down." Ellen's hands moved to the controls with a familiarity that belied her years away from the cockpit. She scanned the instrument panel, her eyes darting over the altimeter, airspeed indicator, and navigation systems. The storm raged outside, lightning illuminating the cockpit in stark flashes, but Ellen's focus was absolute. She adjusted the headset, her voice calm as she contacted air traffic control. Chicago Center, this is Flight 237, Captain Ellen Carter speaking. Our primary pilot is incapacitated, and we're in severe turbulence, requesting vectors for an emergency landing at the nearest airport. The controller's voice crackled back, surprised but professional. Flight 237, this is Chicago Center, confirming Captain Carter stand by for clearance. Ryan, still wrestling with the co-pilot's controls, shot her a look of awe. I heard stories about you, he said. They said you landed a crippled jet in a sandstorm with zero visibility. Is that true? Ellen didn't look at him, her hands steady on the yoke. Focus, Captain, she said. We've got 200 souls on board. Back in the cabin, the passengers sat in stunned silence, their earlier protests replaced by a fragile hope. The woman in 16B stared at the empty seat beside her, her face pale. The businessman clutched his armrest, whispering a prayer. James, still reeling, muttered to himself, Ellen. Captain Carter, how did I not know? The storm raged on, but inside the cockpit, Ellen Carter was no longer the woman in the worn coat. She was Captain Carter, the pilot who had once defied the odds, and she was ready to do it again. The storm raged outside the cockpit of Flight 237, its fury a relentless assault of wind and lightning that battered the Boeing 737 as it hurtled through the turbulent skies. Inside, Ellen Carter sat in the captain's seat, her hands steady on the controls, her eyes locked on the instrument panel, with a focus that seemed to carve order out of chaos. The co-pilot, Captain Ryan Mitchell, worked beside her, his movements quick but precise as he followed her lead. The cabin behind them was a cauldron of fear, the passengers gripping their seats, their earlier judgments forgotten in the face of mortal danger. The plane shuddered violently, its frame groaning under the strain of the storm, but Ellen's voice remained calm as she spoke into the headset. Chicago Center Flight 237. We're at 15,000 feet descending through heavy turbulence, requesting final approach clearance for O'Hare. The controller's voice crackled back, steady but urgent. Flight 237 cleared for runway 28R, wind 270 at 25 knots, gusting to 40. Good luck, Captain Carter. Ellen's lips curved into a faint smile, her hands adjusting the throttle with the precision of someone who had once danced with the skies. In the cabin, the passengers sat in tense silence, their faces pale as the plane rocked and swayed. The woman in 16B, who had recoiled from Ellen's presence earlier, now clutched her armrest, her eyes darting to the empty seat beside her. The businessman across the aisle, his laptop long forgotten, stared straight ahead, his lips moving in a silent prayer. James Larson, still seated in the aisle seat of Ellen's row, was hunched forward, his hands clasped tightly, his earlier arrogance replaced by a raw, humbling fear. The young man in the hoodie, who had mocked Ellen as a delusional old lady, now sat with his head bowed, his phone clutched uselessly in his lap. The mother behind Ellen held her child close, whispering words of comfort that were as much for herself as for her daughter. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, stood near the galley, her face tight with worry but her posture resolute, as she scanned the cabin, ready to act if needed. The storm's roar was deafening, punctuated by flashes of lightning that illuminated the cabin in stark, fleeting bursts, each one a reminder of the peril they faced. Inside the cockpit, Ellen's hands moved with a quiet grace, her every action deliberate and assured. She adjusted the flaps, her eyes flicking between the altimeter and the horizon indicator, compensating for the gusts that threatened to throw the plane off course. Captain Ryan, sweat beading on his forehead, glanced at her with a mix of awe and gratitude. "You're doing it, Captain," he said, his voice low but fervent. "I've never seen anyone handle a storm like this." Ellen didn't respond, her focus absolute, as she guided the plane through the turbulence. The radio crackled again, the controller's voice cutting through. "Flight 237, you're 5 miles out, aligned with runway 28R. Visibility is down to a quarter mile. Can you confirm visual?" Ellen peered through the cockpit window, the world outside a blur of rain and cloud. "Negative, Chicago Center," she said, her voice steady. "We're on instruments. I've got this." Ryan shot her a look, his expression a mix of trust and disbelief. He had heard the stories of Captain Ellen Carter, the Air Force pilot, who had landed a crippled jet in a sandstorm during Desert Storm, but seeing her in action was something else entirely. The plane descended the turbulence relentless, but Ellen's control unwavering. She adjusted the yoke, her hands steady, despite the violent shaking her mind, a fortress of calm amidst the storm. "Gear down," she said, her voice crisp, and Ryan complied, the sound of the landing gear locking into place, a small victory in the chaos. The altimeter ticked downward 10,000 feet, 5,000, 2,000, and the plane broke through the lowest layer of clouds, the runway lights of O'Hare International Airport, faintly visible through the sheets of rain. Ellen's lips moved silently, a habit from her Air Force days, reciting the landing checklist she had memorized decades ago. Ryan watched her, his hands ready to assist, but unnecessary, as Ellen guided the plane with a skill that seemed almost supernatural. The storm fought her every move, but she countered with precision, her hands and mind working in perfect harmony. Back in the cabin, the passengers felt the plane's descent, the pressure in their ears a reminder of their precarious position. The woman in 16B whispered to her companion, her voice trembling, "Do you think she can really do this? That old woman." Her companion, his face pale, shook his head. "I don't know, but she's all we've got." James, still reeling from the revelation of Ellen's identity, stared at the cockpit door, his mind racing. He remembered Ellen from high school, the quiet girl who always had the answers, who never boasted, but always shone. He had dismissed her as a relic of the past, a failure who had squandered her potential. But now he saw the truth. She was no failure. She was a hero, and he had been too blind to see it. The young man in the hoodie, his bravado gone, muttered to himself, "Please, just get us down." The mother behind Ellen hugged her child tighter. Her eyes closed as she whispered, "We're going to be okay." The plane dipped lower, the runway lights growing brighter through the cockpit window. Ellen's voice came over the intercom, calm and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Carter. We're on final approach to Chicago O'Hare. Please remain seated and brace for landing." The passengers, hearing her name and title, exchanged stunned glances. The woman in 16B's jaw dropped, her earlier disdain replaced by a flush of shame. The businessman's eyes widened, his muttered prayer faltering. James shook his head, a mix of guilt and admiration washing over him. The cabin fell silent, the only sound the howl of the storm and the steady hum of the engines as Ellen guided the plane toward the runway. With a final adjustment, Ellen aligned the plane perfectly, the wheels kissing the runway with a gentleness that belied the chaos of the storm. The plane slowed, its frame shuddering slightly as it rolled to a stop, the storm still raging outside, but no longer a threat. A collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin, followed by a burst of applause that started hesitantly but grew into a thunderous ovation. Sarah, standing near the galley, wiped a tear from her eye, her professional composure breaking for the first time. The passengers, their fear replaced by gratitude, clapped and cheered, their earlier judgments forgotten in the wake of their salvation. Ellen, still in the cockpit, removed her headset, and leaned back, her face calm, but her eyes bright with a spark of triumph. Ryan turned to her, his voice thick with emotion. "Captain Carter, that was incredible. You saved us all." Ellen gave a small nod, her voice soft but firm. "Just doing my job, Captain." As Ellen stepped out of the cockpit, the cabin erupted in applause again. She paused, her worn shoes scuffing the carpet, her expression a mix of humility and quiet pride. The woman in 16B stood, her face red with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know. I was wrong about you." Ellen met her gaze, her eyes kind but unyielding. "It's all right," she said. "We all make mistakes." The businessman, his arrogance gone, nodded respectfully, unable to meet her eyes. The young man in the hoodie, his bravado shattered, mumbled, "Thank you, ma'am." The mother behind Ellen reached out, her voice trembling. "You're a hero. Thank you for saving my daughter." Ellen offered a small smile, her hand brushing the child's hair gently. "I'm just glad you're all safe," she said. James approached her, his face a mask of regret. "Ellen, Captain Carter," he said, his voice breaking. "I was an idiot. I didn't know who you were, what you've done. You're still the best of us." Ellen looked at him, her expression softening. "It's not about being the best, James," she said. "It's about doing what's right, even when no one believes in you." Her words hung in the air, a quiet rebuke and a lesson all at once. Before she could say more, a man in a suit pushed through the crowd, his badge identifying him as David Reynolds, a senior official with the airline. "Captain Carter," he said, his voice filled with respect. "We monitored your performance from the ground. That was one of the most remarkable landings I've ever seen. Our board would like to discuss reinstating you effective immediately." The passengers murmured in approval, but Ellen shook her head, her eyes drifting to the window where the storm was finally breaking. "They took my wings once," she said, her voice steady but tinged with resolve. "But they couldn't take my courage. I don't need a job to know who I am." The cabin fell silent, her words sinking in like a stone dropped into still water. One by one, the passengers stood, their applause rising again, not just for her skill, but for the truth she had spoken. They had judged her by her clothes, her age, her quiet demeanor, but she had shown them that true worth lies in action, in courage, in the heart that beats beneath the surface. The lesson was clear: never judge a book by its cover, for the person you dismiss may be the one who saves you. As Ellen gathered her tattered bag and stepped off the plane, the passengers watched her go, their applause echoing in the cabin, a testament to the hero who had reminded them of the power of humility, resilience, and the enduring strength of the human spirit.